Hey, welcome to Let It Be. I'm Vanessa, and this is my little corner of music YouTube. I'm going to go back today to doing a ranking of a band's discography. I haven't done one of those in quite some time. I did T-Rex back, I don't know, probably back last May. So it's been a bit. But today I'm going to do late 70s and 80s band The Cars, which is a band that I really love, especially in their prime period. And I just thought it would be fun to go through their albums and talk about the ones that I liked and some of the ones that I didn't like as much. But it's mostly positive here. I'm just going to say before we get into it because I like them a lot. So they're a band that I would say that I got into somewhat slowly in some ways because I started out just knowing some of their big hits, of course, because they're pretty inescapable. And they were always a fixture on 80s weekends that they had on Much Music, which is like the Canadian MTV, if you're not familiar, which is basically my bread and butter growing up because I lived in a small town and our radio station was not really ideal for a young person wanting to get into music. So Much Music was really my only option to explore new things. So they had this thing in the 90s called the 80s Weekends where they would play a whole weekend just of all 80s videos. So I got familiar with a lot of artists that way that I probably wouldn't have heard otherwise because my parents are not really fans of the era. So that's how I got to know the Cars at first, I'd say. Over the years, I got a compilation in the 2000s, back when iTunes was a thing, the complete greatest hits, which I think came out in the early 2000s. And it was a pretty extensive compilation of their hits. And it made me realize that I love every single song on it. And I thought they were great. And I started to explore their albums slowly. So prior to this dive, the only ones that I hadn't heard were the last two albums because I just never got to them. You never really heard anything too great about them. And we'll see if that was for a reason. Anyway, so I'll just get right into it. Enough of the preamble. So I'll start with my number seven, which is unsurprisingly probably 1987's Door to Door. Starts off okay. The first song, Leave or Stay, is all right. Nothing to the level of their best albums, but it's okay. And then it goes into You Are the Girl, which is a decent single, but far from their best. Like the standards for their singles was pretty high at this point. So it's definitely not up to that level. And it's probably the only song from this album that I would say that I ever hear at any point. So I'm not big on the muddled, more hard rock sounding Double Trouble that comes next. And I feel that's where the trouble with this album really sets in. This overall feels like a bit of an all over the place effort. There's nothing wrong with embracing different styles because that was one thing that I think they were due for in some ways. But this seems to completely lack consistency. It's not the way to do it. So up to this point, they had been very consistent. And that is one thing that, whether you like them or not, I'd say that's something that you have to give them credit for. This album changes that a bit. So perhaps this is due to it being a self-produced album as opposed to having a strong outside producer, which they previously did. That was always something that was a factor on the previous five albums. On one hand, it doesn't necessarily lean super far into that mid to late 80s sound, but on the other, it does seem like many of the songs here are not up to the level that they were on previous albums, regardless of what they sound like. They just don't think the core songs are as good. And it doesn't always necessarily feel like the Cars. And I can see why they would have to kind of shift gears at this point in just the decade. The popular sounds had changed. So they were probably trying to evolve with that, but I don't think that they really figured out how to make that fit in. But at the end of the day, it's the songs that are failing them here more than any of that other stuff. So even the singles that they picked are lackluster compared to past albums. And I think there's a good reason why they've mostly been forgotten. I didn't really even recognize a lot of them when I was listening. And That statement really describes this album. The songs here are just not the same level as their previous albums. And while I wouldn't call this album outright bad, it's just incredibly mediocre. And it leaves you wondering what happened in a few short years, because obviously I have already talked about Heartbeat City a bit in my 1984 video, and that is a much better example of coming up with the times while still retaining your identity and writing amazing songs. So the previous year, Rick also released what I consider his worst solo album. So this is not a great time for them, I don't think. So this is a 2.5 stars for Door to Door. And then on to number 6, which is 2011's Move Like This. So, for an album recorded more than 20 years after their last one, and missing one key band member, of course, because Benjamin Orr had sadly passed away in 2000, this is not bad. It's also not what I would consider essential. It's an easy listen and pleasant while it's on, but I would also say that it's ultimately in one ear and out the other. There aren't really any songs that stand out as being great, but there also aren't any that stand out as being bad. They aren't reinventing the wheel here, mostly sticking to a relatively classic, albeit modernized sound. But maybe it's age or the passing of time, but something is missing that puts it that would put it among the past albums. It's but at the same time, it's far from an embarrassment, and it's a much nicer album to end their discography on than the grim Door to Door. Much like and a completely unrelated band, Black Sabbath ended with 13, which was a much better album than the previous last album of their career. I think that I'm glad this is here as a coda to replace Door to Door as the final album, but at the same time, it's not something that I'm going to go back to really for any reason other than to go through their catalog. So those two are what I would consider the inessential albums by the Cars, but from this point forward, we are into the essential stuff. So starting the essential portion of their ranking, I'm going with number 5, and that is Shake It Up from 1981. So they return to a more straight ahead pop approach on this album, with more in common with the first two albums than Panorama. It opened strong with Since You're Gone and the title track. Although when I was listening, I was thinking I might have flipped their order for just sequencing, but that's just a minor nitpick. And I also love I'm Not the One, which was a good choice for a song to make a single later on their first greatest hits album in the mid 80s, and which perhaps righted the wrong of it not being one at this time because it's a great song. There are some cool deep cuts on here, but there are not quite as strong overall as some of the other albums before it. But I do think that there are plenty of standouts. I think Cruiser, This Could Be Love, they're standouts on this album. It's an album that is very good. It doesn't quite live up to some of the others ahead of it in the ranking, even if it's still overall a very consistent album. I think that it's good that they shake it up after this album, as I think their sound was heading in the direction of perhaps feeling more, not necessarily formulaic, but that they've kind of been in this area before, that they've done this. Maybe it was time to do something different. So even though I still like this a lot, and there's several awesome songs and great singles here, it's the one that leaves me feeling that they're maybe going towards coasting a little bit. So that is 4 stars for me. And that is my only 4-star. So number 4 is 1984's Heartbeat City. So this little section of the list has flipped around a bunch of times. This is where I'm landing ultimately here. I think that they were wise to go in a different direction here and switch things up with a new producer. Their partnership with Roy Thomas Baker was great and led to some amazing albums. But I think it was clear on the previous album that it was time to move forward and do something different. So I think their partnership with Mutt Lange worked out well to produce an album that brought out that big 80s sound while also retaining their identity and letting their songwriting shine. And they still sound like the Cars here, but they sound like they're making an album more in step with the times that they were in. So one thing about this album that I think is great is the fact that it has so many hits. And I will never get sick of them, which is kind of amazing because they get played a lot. But there are also a lot of equally strong album cuts as well. And that is something that I mentioned in my 1984 video when I talked about this video. This was an era of big singles, just in general. but many times the corresponding albums had a very clear division in quality between singles and filler. And that is something I found a lot when I was doing a dive of the year 1984. But even with all the classics on here, Looking for Love is my favorite song on the album. And I think some other songs like Stranger Eyes and Why Can't I Have You would fit right in on like a movie soundtrack or something. And maybe they were on some that I'm not sure, not aware of. But I think that regardless, they would fit in all, this is an album where the band sounds reinvigorated and make a big 80s pop album that lives up to its promise and maybe one of the better examples of a band doing that overall, I think, personally. So yeah, Heartbeat City, it's great. I know that it's kind of a bit of a divisive one among people who like the band, but I think it's awesome. So it's a 4.5-star album for me. So here's where things get a little like, this is where I'm landing now, but these albums are all just top notch. Number 3 is 1979's Candy O. I think that Let's Go is a great way to open this album. It's catchy and propulsive, and it gets you ready to go along for the ride and listen to the rest of this and get right into it. I love the build up on the chorus of Since I Held You, and I love the guitar solo on it. Much like the debut, the songs flow seamlessly into each other to reveal catchy banger after catchy banger. And I've seen people call this a bit of a step down from the debut, but I don't really think that it is one, or if it is, it's not much of one. It's just that it doesn't quite have as many songs that have become ubiquitous in popular culture, maybe. I don't know. But that's really the main difference, I would say. I think on a quality level, they are pretty well even. And there are tons of standouts on here as well. They stretch out a little bit more here. Something like Shooby Doo functions as a bit of a cool interlude, but its slight edge adds a cool lead into the title track. I really think that's always just such an awesome transition there, and I really enjoy that. Night Spots is full of cool keyboard and guitar lines. I think Got a Lot on My Head is another gem that's on the album. And I think this album has a lot to offer with more overlooked gems, broadly speaking, when you compare it to something like the debut or Heartbeat City. And it would be pretty tough to follow up their debut because that is a pretty slamming way to come out the gate, really. But I think that they basically nail it here, and it's just as great. If not, some people think it's greater. It's hard to argue that. So everything here in this first section is on such a similar level. It is quite hard to rank them, but I am going to go still with 4.5 stars for myself on this one, but it's a high 4.5. So my number 2 is one that's really grown for me in the last little while, and one that's sort of revealed itself as a favorite, kind of as a bit of a surprise. But I'm going to go with Panorama from 1980 at number 2. So they changed their sound on this album, which mixes things up a bit from the first 2 albums. This is immediately apparent on the opener Panorama, which has a bit of a darkness to it. I love the guitar riff on the chorus and how it leaves you wanting more. I like how the darkness and edge that they introduce on this album marries itself with their pop sensibilities, like on Touch and Go, which is an amazing single that a lot of people considered their best single, and I can't say that I argue too much with that. This album took me a little longer to gel with, since it's not as immediate as their other ones in this era. Those are stacked with recognizable songs, and there's only one hit that you ever hear on this one. But over time, it has really grown on me, and especially since it's got its own vibe and it's got lots of cool songs on it. Like, I love every song on this album. One thing I find especially rewarding about the Cars discography, especially in this first golden era, is that treasure trove of hidden gems. And this album is a gold mine. I mean, because it only has that one song that you hear, everything else is like hidden gems. So that's always my favorite thing when it comes to albums, especially by bands that I love, is when they can find an album that has all this stuff on it that I just never hear, but it's just as great as the stuff that you do hear. So this album is a huge example of that. And I think they continue to sound ahead of their time here, which may have been some of the issue at the time because this album was slammed by critics and I guess the public to some degree. I was reading some of the critical reception at the time, and they were calling it joyless and tuneless, which I really don't hear at all. I think it's still at the same level of quality, especially in the songwriting, and they're doing some different things that are really cool. And I really think that they really give Elliot Easton a lot of times to shine on this. Like the guitar on this album is great. Like the last song, Up and Down, and just the way that he augments every part with such cool tone and like a difference. Like that's one of my favorite things about that song. It's a cool song anyway, but listening to what he does in each section of the song is just it's just really great. So yeah, I come to really love Panorama and become like singing the gospel for Panorama. So it's 5 stars for me. Absolutely love it, but still not my number one, which is basically, I would say the expected number one, but I think it is for a reason, and that is their debut from 1978, The Cars. Pretty well a cliche at this point to say that the debut is better than some bands' greatest hits albums. Like they come right out the gate with basically their own greatest hits in one album. I've heard this album tons of times, and I still find myself knocked out by the sheer pop perfection of the first 3 songs kicking off the album. A good majority of this album is still played regularly on the radio and in popular culture to the point where it makes the remaining songs truly feel like, as I keep saying, hidden gems. I'm in Touch with Your World is otherworldly with its twinkling synths, and Don't Just Stop is catchy as hell. What really strikes me about this album, even today, is just how damn fresh it sounds. Even almost 50 years later, which is crazy to say that 1978 was almost 50 years ago. That seems insane, but it's kind of true. It somehow manages to sound classic, but also sound somewhat futuristic, like it's the 80s before the 80s were here. And the songs flow into each other seamlessly. And every piece is on point, from Greg Hawkes' keyboards to Elliot Easton's lead guitar to David Robinson's drums, Benjamin Orr's bass work. And this is true of all of those first 5 albums. I think they work so well together and just play their part in a way that enhances every song and but never gets in the way of each other. Like they don't feel like they're at war with each other. Everybody's doing their part to make everything great. And that really stands out. And sometimes one stands out as shining above the others, but that's just what the song needs. Like they always seem to serve the song so well. Everything is so tight and it just sounds so clean. I love how they close everything out on a more epic sounding note with All Mixed Up, just the right amount of grandeur to close out this perfect pop album. So, also, of course, 5 stars. So, yeah, that is my ranking of the Cars discography. Just a band that I love a lot, and the more I listen to, the more I love them. And one rare example of a band that has a ton of big songs that you hear all the time that I am not sick of. I'm not sick of any of them. I can't name a single one of their singles that I am tired of, that I don't want to hear. I'm always happy to hear them, even now. So, not many bands can say that. So, in addition to the dive, just as a bit of a coda here, I listened to the majority of their solo albums, which, with the only exception being Greg Hawkes' album of ukulele Beatles covers, because I wasn't able to hear it anywhere for one thing, but not sure that I needed an entire album of that. I did hear one song and that was enough, but all power to him for doing something totally different and that he obviously loves doing. So that's super cool. I also checked out Milkwood with Rick and Benjamin from the early 70s, and Greg's also on that album a bit. It wasn't super exciting, but it was cool to hear them doing a completely different thing. They were at a very different phase of their career and doing something totally different from what the Cars would sound like. It's kind of more of a folk rock thing. And while it's not like super exceptional for the genre, it's a nice album. It's a cool album. It's really neat to hear them at that stage. And they sound quite different, but you can still tell it's them. So that's really neat. So as far as the solo albums go, we have a bit of a mixed bag with quality. I would say that Elliot Easton's solo album, Change No Change, is one of my favorites, as well as Rick Ocasek's 1997 album, Troublizing. Those are the 2 that I liked the best for sure. Troublizing was a bit of a surprise because while his albums up to that point there had been some good ones and some that I didn't like as much, I wasn't expecting an album in 1997 to be the one that I liked the best, but that's how it turned out. He worked with Billy Corgan and some other younger artists at the time, and he brought his sound up with the times, but without really compromising his identity, and he still sounded like himself. And he didn't sound like what a lot of older artists did in the 90s, this very cringy kind of like, hey, it's the 90s, here we are, getting up with the times, but they sound like they don't belong in the sound. Like they sound like they're trying on someone else's shoes or something. But I don't think Rick did that at all. I think he sounds great and the songs are super cool. And it was just a really nice surprise to like that album a lot. And overall, I'd say his solo album was pretty good. With Beatitude from 1982 also being a strong entry. That's his first solo album. That one was cool. And also Greg Hawkes's synth album from 1983, I believe, was called Niagara Falls. That's one I liked a lot more than I expected. I expect it was pretty big inspiration for later synthwave and that kind of sound. It's mostly instrumental. There's a little bit of vocals, but it's not really a feature of it. And it felt very futuristic. It was really cool. And I really enjoyed that. It was only available on YouTube for me, but it was worth checking out. The only one I found sort of disappointing was Benjamin Orr's album, The Lace. It was okay. It was kind of like an AOR kind of thing. And I didn't love it. I didn't hate it. It was fine, but it was not something I'd go back to. But it was really cool to explore what they all did on their own. And it was kind of neat that most of them had their own solo career albums to check out. So that was a bit of a nice way to wrap things up and work on and do a sort of a side project along with this project. Anyway, that's my ranking of the cars. I know that there's a lot of different ways that you could put these in order. So I'd love to hear your ranking and what your favorites are, what your least favorites are. I'd be absolutely curious to see if there's anyone who is anyone out there who is willing to really stick up for Door to Door and maybe tell me what makes that album great. I'd be curious to see that. I'm not sure. I've never heard anybody do that, so I'd be curious to see that. Anyway, till next time. Bye.